Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Downtown Den, and we are going to be joined any moment now. In fact, just by magic, the recently announced Shadow Sports Minister, Alison McGovern, is with us in the Downtown Den today. And Ali, as well as, of course, being a sports fanatic and therefore being given almost her dream job. Of course, Minister for Sport will probably be an even better one for her. She's been a vocal, progressive voice within the Labour Party, so I'll be also asking her views on the leadership election of Keir Starmer, where she thinks that takes the Labour Party. But before we get into the politics, we're going to get the bats and balls out, and we're going to talk to Ali about all things sport. Good morning, Alison.
Morning, Frank. Good to see you.
It's good to see you, and I think this is a rather earlier start than we're used to, certainly for the Town Den, but nonetheless a very popular event, despite that fact. And first of all, congratulations on the new job.
Thanks. It is, as you said, like it's pretty much a dream role for me. I like sports. The only problem that I have is that I am the Shadow Sports Minister, not the Shadow Football Minister. And football has played such a big part in my life that I feel like I need to make sure that my range of sports is properly wide enough, not just.
Yeah, I can imagine that's going to be. Well, I'm sure you'll be able to brush up on the many other sports that you'll be expected to engage with in the future months. And
I actually like a lot of sports. It's just I always end up talking about football.
And we're going to talk a bit about football today, as you would imagine, but there's other things to get into as well. You say, sort of a dream job, and I won't name them, but two former prime ministers, when I asked them the question, what job would you have liked to have been able to do? Both said to me, and by the way, one was a Tory, both said to me, I'd love to have been Minister for Sport. And then Mayborn, of course, when he was Minister for Sport during the Blair government, said to me he just couldn't believe his luck. And he had a whale of a time. But of course, the things that those guys enjoy most is attending live events, meeting their sporting heroes and sporting legends. And at this moment in time, Ali, you're not able to do that. So before we talk about the impact of the crisis on sport, just tell me what the day-to-day life of an MP is like at this moment in time, when you're dealing with what must be an insurmountable range of issues to do with the coronavirus crisis.
Well, the first thing is, like everybody at the moment, my life is one long video conference, and I think everybody's, just trying to do as much of the job as they can, but in a different way. So, first thing in the morning, I'll meet my team, we'll run through what cases we've had in, what constituents have got in touch with us, what the big issues are. It seems to be coming in waves. So right at the start of this crisis, we had a massive wave of people worried about employment and their business. And then we got some of the business support stuff online, and I and other MPs were really engaged in sort of making that as good as it possibly can be. And it's still not perfect, but I think we've come a long way. Then we had a wave of people who were stuck abroad. So a lot of MPs have been trying to help get constituents back from far-flung places. I have learned just how far the people of the Wirral travel through this. And then we've had actually really, really heartbreaking, very serious cases of a lot of constituents where they've got a loved one in hospital or in a care home, and for whatever reason there's complications, or that person needs more support, or members of staff that need protective equipment or other things. So there's basically like different kinds of problems, and we're just trying to work through them all. there's a regular call between members of parliament and government ministers, because if you think about members of parliament, we're really like 650 field agents at the moment. You know, we can see all of the individual problems in our constituencies, and our job is to work out what the structural underlying problems are, get them to government as quickly as possible, and see if we can get them sorted out. So we're kind of listening to constituents, taking it to government, and keeping that feedback loop going. So that's sort of like my first job. And then there's the virtual parliament, which has been a revelation for those of us on the progressive side of politics who always suspected that there was a different way of doing this whole House of Commons thing. Actually, to see those screens go up in the Commons and to have members of parliament being able to dial in through video conferencing from wherever they are in the country has been really, you know, a kind of silver lining in a terrible situation. And that means, you know, in the afternoon, I may, you know, if there's something that's relevant to me or I'm drawn for a question, I'll be dialing into Westminster and doing that. I'm also still on Treasury Select Committee for a bit. So yesterday we had scrutiny of the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the number 2 minister in the Treasury. So there's parliamentary work to do alongside casework, and then getting my head around the new job and chatting and meeting people, mainly not in person, unfortunately, but trying to kind of think through some of the issues. And you know, there's a lot of challenges in sport at the moment. So it may not be quite the perfect moment to be taking over, which would probably be like 6 months before, you know, some sort of like fantastic World Cup or something like that. But yeah, but it's an important moment, and I relish the challenge.
Well, let's get into that challenge then and talk about some of those difficulties that the world of sport is facing, because similarly to the hospitality sector that is in dire straits at the moment and are really worried about the future, we have, you know, big economic animals such as the Premier League, Formula One, the Wimbledon tennis tournaments being cancelled. You know, there's so many of these.
Horse racing.
Yeah, there's so many horse racing should have been cancelled a little bit before, but we might get into that conversation later.
Yeah.
But you know, let's get the football out first, because it's your passion, it's mine. But equally, I think what people who perhaps not necessarily interested in football will appreciate is that the Premier League is one of, if not the most successful English export of modern times. Literally millions of people across the globe watch the Premier League of a weekend. And of course, that also boosts not just revenue into the country via all sorts of media outlets, but also enhances reputations of cities like Liverpool, like Birmingham, like Manchester, because football is such a key ingredient of what those cities have to offer. Now, I don't know if you saw Gary Neville's comments yesterday, Alison, and I know Gary, in terms of his football allegiances, are a million miles away from yours, but I don't think his politics are massively different from what I pick up. He actually was saying that he expected the sports minister to be right in the middle of the conversations with the Premier League as to when the league may resume or make a decision otherwise. What's your take on, let's start with the Premier League and then talk about the wider football industry?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I have been in a street market in Ghana on a visit and looked upwards to the television, and you know, it was a Premier League game that people were watching. You know, all of those thousands of miles away in Africa. It is an incredible cultural force, the Premier League, and so it's complicated for the Premier League because they have all kinds of contractual and legal arrangements that this terrible crisis has cut in the middle of. And you know, personally, when it comes to this, as you would expect, Frank, I am a Kloppite in that I do think Jurgen was right to say all of that. Football is very, very, very important to us, but it doesn't matter in comparison to people's lives. I think, you know, that is absolutely the right place to be. But that said, the Premier League is both this amazing cultural force. It is integrated into societies and towns in a way that it has a real impact on the economy. If you know, if we think about any big city in Britain, actually what happens with the football has a big impact on their hospitality economy, on the visitor economy, on hotels and all the rest of it. So it is really important economically. So what should we do? Well, I think the first thing that has to be said is that people's health does come first, and we need clarity. Now, right at the beginning of this crisis, I was a little bit unhappy that we didn't have clear messages coming from government right in the beginning when the evacuees came from Wuhan to the Wirral. And I think, unfortunately, whilst I'm massively supportive of the kind of broad government efforts and everything that's been done by the health service, I think, unfortunately, at particular stages, we have lacked government clarity over what the plan is. And so that's why Keir Starmer and other people, you know, in politics, I think have tried to push the government on what the exit strategy should be. And that applies for the Premier League. We need what we would call as a contingent exit plan. So like, once the government's tests are met, what is it going to look like? There's some absolutely crucial questions that I would expect top scientists to be looking at. Nobody expects us to go back to crowds of 50,000 anytime soon, of course not. But if we are going to have games that could be broadcast, what are the scientific health-based constraints? And those are the questions that I would expect people to be testing. And those are the questions that I'll be raising with the sports minister and others. Being honest, I do agree with Gary Neville. I do. It's slightly hard to say that, but I do. Actually, I think Gary Neville's probably, you know, as a pundit, he's actually really good. It's like, I guess Gary Neville's my guilty pleasure in football punditry. But because the one thing that he pointed out that I think is really, really important is about incentives, in that the Premier League is basically made up of these, you know, big clubs, all with different contractual arrangements, all with slightly different financial situations. And then you've got the pyramid where clubs are in, you know, very difficult and different situations. And when it comes to football, there isn't really coordination. I think people assume that football is a lot more organised than it actually is, whereas the Premier League run a competition, the Football League run a competition, the FA run the grassroots, and you know, their competitions. Like, actually, you do need somebody who can look across the whole of football and talk to the Premier League about how what they do might impact the rest of football, and bring it all together and coordinate what they need with the health and scientific experts. So on this, though it pains me, I think Gary Neville's spot on.
And you touch on the Premier League and then those lower division clubs. And again, I think there's an assumption the Premier League clubs are all filthy rich, because of course all of the playing staff within all of those 20 clubs are literally earning millions of pounds a year. But equally, clubs such as Bournemouth and Burnley have indicated by the time of August, September, if this continues in the situation that we are now, they're going to be in financial difficulties. So the economics of football is not sane, in my opinion. Perhaps there will be a reset button following this, and we'll start to look at the game from a business perspective slightly differently. But the point I'm making really, Alison, is that outside of the top probably 8 clubs, and I'm not talking about the top 8 in the league, top 8 clubs who have got, you know, multi-billion. Yeah, you know, after that, there's an awful lot of clubs out there, and some names that may surprise 1 or 2 people, that are going to be in genuine trouble if those contractual obligations somehow, some way, are not met.
That's right. So there's really good information on this. There's the Deloitte football finances report that if people aren't aware of it, it is actually worth looking at, because I think we do put Premier League football clubs in this bucket of organisations that, oh well, they'll be fine because there's loads of money in football. And yes, there is, revenue is high, but also costs are really high. So, you don't need to be, a vastly experienced business person to understand what that means, which is that when revenues are massively put at risk like this, actually the whole structure looks a lot more fragile than people might think, which is another reason why you need coordination. Because one principle that I think we should stick to through this is that no town or city or community should lose a loved sports team because of coronavirus. So whether it's, I've met people from Bury who went through that terrible experience of being thrown out of the Football League and what's happened to their club. Real FC shut down recently because they couldn't pay their rent. And I think once you do unpick the finances of it, you realise actually it's a lot more fragile than people might think. We need government to come forward with a plan. How can we create a partnership in football to use this moment of crisis to make the whole structure more sustainable? Like we talk about the football pyramid, but actually if you look at the finances of this, you've got the wealthiest Premier League clubs by revenue. Then you've got the other clubs in the Premier League, many of whom have challenges of different kinds depending on the team. Then you've got the Championship, where the parachute payments are very influential in the finances. But actually, you then have quite the cliff edge where the levels of revenue drop away really sharply. And I just asked myself a question, which is the money at the top of the game really filtering through? Because the government make an argument that those finances at the top of the game trickle down the pyramid. Well, if you look at the finances of League One, League Two, and the non-league game, I'm not sure they do. So I think we should take this moment to say, okay, how do we work with League One, League Two clubs and the non-league clubs to say, is there a way that we can use a partnership with local government to make your finances more sustainable? There are lots of clubs out there who do it well. There's some really good examples of clubs that are financially sustainable. So is there a way that we can learn from those that are doing it well and make the whole structure more sustainable? And if we could do that, again, it would be a silver lining out of what has been a very difficult time for football.
I do think there will be a review of the way football is managed. And I also, just before we leave the beautiful game and talk about many other aspects of sport that I want to get into this morning, there's been a takeover in the Premier League of Newcastle United, or a proposed takeover. And again, for many years now, there have been big question marks over this terminology that is used of fit and proper person to run a football club. You've referenced Bury, Alison. We could go over the past decade and pick out owners who have not necessarily done the right thing by the football club that they own. And as you rightly say, it may, to people who are not interested or involved in the game of football in terms of supporters, rightly or wrongly, there's a huge emotional attachment from many communities, and football clubs are often at the heart of those communities. So it's a bigger impact than simply say, oh, well, a football club's gone bust, never mind. Do you think that the government should be more active in talking to the Premiership when you have, and I don't want to get into any legalese here because this is being broadcast live and recorded. So, and these football owners have deeper pockets than even me, Alison. But do you think that actually the government now has almost a moral duty to be saying to the Football League, the Premier League, you've got to tighten these rules, because we do not want characters coming into our business community who've got the sort of track record that appears to be the case with the potential new owners of Newcastle United. I'm not much fussed on the current owner of Newcastle United and his business practices, but you can actually get worse. Where do you stand on that?
So I could bore for England on this subject, because over the past 10 years, when I've been a Member of Parliament, this has been a constant. I mean, I became a Member of Parliament just as Liverpool got some new owners that were very controversial, and, you know, we ended up in a complete mess, I would argue, there. So I feel like the past 10 years have been a massive missed opportunity on this. The government could have helped football undo a lot of the bad systematic problems that put football clubs at risk. So the first issue on it's the owners and directors test, as is now, which the Premier League manage through their rule book. I think, you know, we could literally spend hours on, you know, unpicking what the problem is with that owners and directors test. And I think, you know, but basically the government should get more involved there in, you know, football is our national game, and I think they should work together with the Premier League and other governing bodies to improve that. There are issues like the football creditors rule, you know, about, you know, who gets paid when a football club does get into difficulties that lots of people in football have been unhappy with for a long time. And these issues just haven't been dealt with over the past 10 years. You know, whether it's, we had a select committee report from the Culture and Sports Select Committee in 2011 that literally went through all these issues about football governance and asked the government to do something about it. And at that point, they were making warm noises that they were going to review it, and they said they would. You know, call it Brexit getting in the way or whatever, they never have. Anyway, we've got a new Tory sports minister now. Conservative government had in their manifesto a reform of football governance. So we're still kind of at the same point, and I will be putting a lot of pressure on the Conservative government to actually do what they've said that they were going to do for the past 10 years. Because they've literally, in December, got re-elected on a manifesto that said that they would do it. And without going through all the details of the reforms, I think pretty much there's cross-party agreement on so much of this. We just need to bring it forward and start to get it done. So I would anticipate that there will be a review over governance, and that on the Labour side and the Conservative side we'll be working quite closely together to get it right and to get it done. I think when it comes to foot ownership in general, I'd go back to that very simple principle that I articulated before, which is, you know, when you care about a sports team, yes, football, but also lots of other sports. Rugby league, for example, is at massive risk at the moment. I worry about what's going on in the cricket, because, you know, their season is absolutely going to be torn to shreds by this. So if you care passionately about a sport, it's not just that's, you know, a leisure activity that you sort of do, but, you know, you're not that fussed about. It's your culture and your history and your heritage. I mean, my lovely granddad's ashes are sprinkled in the Cop Goalmouth. You know, this is a massive thing in who we are as people. And so should we allow clubs to just go under and that's just part of life? I would say no. So that implies that government has a responsibility to make sure it's governed right in the first place so collapse is prevented, and to have a package of measures that it can implement if clubs are put at risk, so that the local community can come together and figure out what they want to do and what their aspirations are for that sports team that's been at the centre of their town or their place.
Now, if football's the national game, Alison, you've referenced there a number of other sports, cricket, horse racing you mentioned earlier as well. And the Liverpool International Tennis Tournament, which is something we've enjoyed for over a decade now, that's had to be cancelled. You know, so many of these sporting activities are going out of the window. The economics of those sports are not necessarily as large in some respects as football, but as you've indicated there that they're equally important. And I suppose, not to lump them all together, but we can't go through every single sport individually because we would be here all day.
Yeah.
But at what point?
What about climbing?
Yeah, exactly. At what point, and this is a point that's sort of being made by some of the people who are watching this morning, with us this morning. At what point do the economics begin to overtake the health implications of a return to sport and a return to crowds? And I know that the instinct within people like you and I, Ali, would always be, well, people's health has got to come first. But then, there is increasing evidence to suggest that if lockdown continues, if we are unable as human beings to go about our usual day-to-day activity, then actually the health issues going forward may be even more serious than what we're dealing with the pandemic. It's a difficult balance to strike, Ali. Where do you sit in the...
So it is, and I think that in politics we often talk about being led by the science as if that was an easy thing to do, and it's just like, oh well, we'll just get the science down off the shelf and we'll just follow the road. It doesn't work like that. It's all a balance. It's all a balance, and we know that the impact on our health is complex of this situation. There is the extreme risk of the virus, and then there are the associated risks of us all, having limited access to physical activity that we might otherwise wish to undertake. I think there's been some really worrying numbers about the impact on particularly kids from poorer backgrounds and the reduction in physical activity for them, which has a knock-on impact, doesn't it? If you're growing up in an environment where you maybe live in a housing situation where you don't have loads of access to green space nearby, that has an impact on people that I'm very worried about right at this moment. Speaking purely personally, I've been having this sort of conversation with myself. If somebody could bring back the football for me to watch, or my football teams that I play in, which would I want first, watching or playing?
Yeah.
I think I'd go for playing, because I know that we're probably, because of the safety element, more likely to get like football without fans that we can all watch first. But actually, I think the thing that I really miss is turning round on a Thursday night with my mates from Wirral Valkyries FC and, having a laugh. And I think that's the thing about sport that really has kept me going over the past few years, being able to turn up and my friends who I play football with they don't really talk to me about politics that much, but it's having that physical activity and the camaraderie that goes along with it that we're all really missing at the moment, and that has an impact. So I think what we have to do is be realistic about the science, and people's health and people's lives come first. But I say again, this is why we need a practical exit plan, contingent on meeting trigger points where we know that activity is safe to do. How will we come out of this situation in a way that we can mobilize those things that will be really good for us first? So one thing we haven't talked about as much is grassroots physical activity. I think that councils have had a really powerful experience, I think, of understanding just how important their parks and their open spaces are. So how can we mobilize that knowledge and understanding to, as we move out of this situation, to get people doing even more physical activity and making the most of just the green spaces around them. I think we've learned how important that is to people, and how crucial some of those local authorities are, in a sort of world where they've had to deal with austerity for 10 years. Actually, I think people have learned how important green open spaces are, grassroots sports activity. So I would like to see the government bring forward a plan for that, so that we know at that point where it's safe to do so, that we can use our open spaces and our grassroots sporting facilities to really give people a good chance to get active again, and to feel that positive mental health benefit of getting active.
And I think, you know, we would all echo that. We would want to see sport at any level back as quickly as possible. You know, you, as you said, have daily briefings with government ministers. We watch the press conference. Well, some of us continue to watch the press conferences, but they're becoming increasingly mundane, I think, because they tend to not say anything much different. Are you getting a sense that the government are moving towards some sort of strategy post-lockdown?
Yesterday, we asked this question of the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, myself and my fellow Treasury Select Committee members, and he wouldn't be drawn, but he said that the Prime Minister would announce something in the coming days. So I do get the impression that they are moving towards that. You never know with the government, you know, they can be pretty tight-lipped until they're ready to say publicly what it is they're planning. But we did push him quite hard, and the Chief Secretary was sort of holding back, but basically intimating that we would hear more about that in the days to come.
Okay. Let's move the conversation on. And the influence of sport, as you've said, touches communities, and, you know, those emotional attachments and the enjoyment that we get from sport, it is fantastic. But the other area of our community that sport has started to have a huge influence on in recent times, it is business and leadership and management. And so many business organisations now are looking to the successful sports clubs and sports organisations and leaders, such as your own manager, Jurgen Klopp, to actually take tips and tricks of their motivational abilities and their managerial styles to bring into the world of business. And so our sponsors this morning, for example, VSI Executive Education, they take people from the world of sport, but also now the world of business, and talk through some of those experiences that sports people face, because very often their challenges can be quite unique, but can be replicated in terms of the business situation. Now, I know, Alison, on two aspects of this really from your personal perspective. One is that you are hugely keen to see businesses thrive and grow across the UK. And so, you know, how do you think, again, we can perhaps get better at that cooperation and collaboration between sport and business and learn those lessons? And again, you know, you touched on it earlier, sport itself is perhaps not the best managed sort of sector and industry when it comes to the business side of things. So is there anything we can do to put those two things together and get a good result and a positive outcome? The other thing that BSI have been particularly successful at, and again, I know this is a passion of yours, is to actually start to begin to encourage more women into executive roles within the world of sport. And again, both in terms of a participatory level and in terms of getting those leaders into sports and organisations. I know that female agenda is something close to your heart. So pick those 2 points up for me, if you will.
I will. I mean, let me say three things. Firstly, I think athletes have an incredible mindset. I think to be an athlete, you have to win physical battles, but the mental battles you have to win almost are tougher. And I'm seeing that at the moment, actually. I was listening to 5 Live interview some athletes who were planning for the Olympics. And they were talking to them about how you reset when you've been working for that moment, that point where you're going to try and achieve your goal, and then that chance is taken away from you. How do you reset and recalibrate your goals? And that is the most incredible resilience that actually, for anybody in the political world or business world, or in any other arena where you face challenges, developing that resilience, I think we all know is an absolutely crucial skill that you can't succeed without. So I think the idea that sport has a lot to teach us, I think, is right. And I think it has a huge amount to teach us in terms of mindsets and mental health, really. We know on the flip side that there's within sport that without those, like without that mental strength as well as the physical strength, you know, people can get all kinds of problems. Well, and you know, I think that within that kind of passion that we all have for physical activity, I think it's really interesting to reflect on what it gives, the interaction between the physical health and the mental health. And I know that is something that my predecessor as the Labour Shadow Minister for Sport and now Shadow Minister for Mental Health, Rosanna Allen Khan, has talked a lot about. And you know, it's an important lesson for us all. You need to be physically healthy, but also be constantly thinking about how you approach your own thoughts and feelings to make sure that you're mentally healthy too. So we have a huge amount to learn. Now, from a business point of view, I think that we've talked about the governance issues in football, yes. On the other hand, I would also point to the huge amounts of small and medium-sized businesses in and around sport that do really well and show incredible innovation, actually, and are using sport, whether it's mobilizing different apps and things like that from a fan perspective, people who want to get involved in sport. We've seen a lot of innovation in terms of the kind of fan community, or whether it's just like the hospitality and the other aspects in and around sport. There's a lot of SMEs that I think do really well, and I think we could learn from their innovation and how they've used people's passion for sport to make credible businesses that are doing things differently. I think we could learn there as well. So I think there's a huge amount of positive innovation that's going on around sport that has a lot to, that the rest of the economy has a lot to learn from. But, you know, technology is one thing. I mean, there's fascinating insights into people's health and how you improve people's health through the innovation that's come from sport in relation to nutrition and, you know, people's physical health. And I really think we'd kind of make the most of that as a country and take some of those learnings, you know, and use them to work out how we make the country as a whole more healthy. Speaking of which, making the country as a whole more healthy, women. I mean, sport has a checkered history. Incredible women, but unfortunately also like moments of you know, not great things for women, really. And we're seeing a bit of that now. A small club, AFC, filed, but they announced that they're disbanding their women's team as a result of coronavirus, which is devastating. And we've had some pretty bad situations in different parts of the women's game in football. But equally, there does seem to be a momentum around women's sport. So I would say it's in the balance at the moment, whether we can come out of the coronavirus crisis and continue that momentum going with women's sport, or whether you have a moment like there's been moments in our history with women's sport. So like the FA ban, you know, was a real moment in women's sport that kind of set us back decades that it's taken years and years and years to recover from. You know, will this be a moment where women's sport is cut off at the knees, or will we come back stronger? I think it's in the balance at the moment. I take inspiration from you know, women leaders like Baroness Sue Campbell, who runs women's football for the FA. She previously ran the UK Youth Sport Trust, which did a lot of the activities for young people in and around the Olympics. And she's an incredible leader who's managed to carve out a place for women's football in what is an incredibly male-dominated environment. And so I think there are brilliant women leaders in sport, and we have to kind of take our inspiration from them and try and make this the moment where we maintain that momentum, but also we build that stronger, and we say, actually, we do want more equal sporting life after this crisis.
Okay. I'm conscious that we've got a number of questions that I've been texted, and also obviously a couple of people have typed into the chat room. And please, if you've got a question to put to Alison, do type your question, then we'll try and get to it. So, final point from me, Ali. Got some members from Birmingham with us this morning, and of course they are looking forward to the Commonwealth Games. Now, let's forget about the crisis. We won't get into the timing of that and what impact that may have. Both you and I have been fortunate enough to live in a city or a city region that has benefited hugely from a big event, and that was European Capital of Culture for Liverpool back in 2008. We also saw almost firsthand the positive impact that the Commonwealth Games had on Manchester. And then, of course, as a country, we had the Olympics in London, which was a fantastic experience, and also did an awful lot in terms of a more deprived part of London economically, as well as offering us that showcase for our sporting talent. So given the fact that you've watched some of those events, you've been involved in some of those events, what would be the sort of things that you think Brummies should be looking forward to in terms of opportunities and legacy from their Commonwealth Games?
So yes, definitely. All of the things that you mentioned, Frank, just have been absolute amazing lessons in how these big events can change people's perceptions of a place and their experience of a place. I think there are some really important principles with events like this that make them not just a kind of glitzy event that happens and then is gone, but can really be a shift in terms of the way a place is seen and experienced. I should say I love Birmingham, by the way. I really enjoy visiting there. I remember about 15 years ago going on a city break to Birmingham because I'd never been to Villa Park. And I really, really wanted, I don't know why, but there's certain grounds, certain football grounds, like I've never been to St. James's Park, I really want to go there. And like, never been to Villa Park, really want to go. So I went on a little city break to Birmingham. And I mean, the football wasn't perhaps the best football I've ever seen in the world, but the experience of Birmingham itself as a city, as a place to visit, was incredible, brilliant, friendly. So my hope, first and foremost, is that more people in the UK, but around the world, will get to know Birmingham even more than they already do. And I think Birmingham has a lot to offer, and it comes from a strong place on that. But there's some important principles. So inclusion, I think, is a really important thing. I think the Olympics did it well. My experience of the London Olympics was that they set up some principles about making sure that apprenticeships were a win, making sure that jobs outside that were a win for the people who were surrounded by that Olympic village, making sure that the way that the contracting was done actually really got to small business. And I think they had that principle of inclusion from the word go, and that really worked. So I would say that's an important one, being clear about how it's an inclusive games, and that everybody in Birmingham feels the benefit, whether or not they are living right on top of it or whether they live right the other side of the West Midlands. Making sure that people feel a part of it, I think, is really important. And I know that city leaders in Birmingham will be wanting to think about those principles of inclusion. And the other thing I say is legacy. The reason why, for us in Liverpool City region, the reason why 2008 we feel all warm and fuzzy when we think about it isn't necessarily because of, I mean, I can remember particular events of things I did in 2008 that were wonderful, but the reason why I think about it is because it was a turning point for us. I moved to London to be a student in 1999, and when I said to people I was from Merseyside, they used to look at me as if to say, never mind. Or like, it's all right, you've escaped. You know, never, oh. By 2008, when I said where I was from, there was only one question that anybody asked me. And that was, do you know a good hotel? Do you know, I'm going up there. Any good restaurants you'd like to recommend? And so that legacy of 2008 of us becoming from a place that people were embarrassed to talk about and they didn't really want to visit or invest in, to us becoming a place that people were really interested in and wanted to talk about. There was a long legacy of that, and I would argue we're still in it. That it really changed perceptions. And so I would say the really important thing, as I say, I love Birmingham. I think it's an absolutely fantastic place. I really, really love going to Birmingham. And I would just hope that, you know, I don't think Birmingham's in any way in the same position that Liverpool was in for many years at all. But I would hope that this is the moment where Birmingham really has this fantastic international reputation, and we can really say how wonderful Birmingham is for many years to come, and it will be that key in the lock of the reputation. And I think that's where sport is great. Sport is just great, and the Commonwealth Games will be wonderful, but I will hope it will have this bigger impact, and I really look forward to being a part of it.
Okay, thanks for that. And listen, you've said what a great city Birmingham is. We can concur with that. We absolutely love the place, obviously. But equally, I know whilst you were on the Treasury Select Committee, I know you still are at the moment, but you'd agreed to come up to Birmingham, or down to Birmingham, and do an event for us. So with your new hat on, I'm going to keep you to that. We'll get you to Birmingham as soon as
excuse.
As soon as we can. And I don't know when the last time you were there, but it just is one of those cities that you can actively see transforming. You know, it's fantastic in terms.
I was there in December, and I really like it.
They're doing a great job.
I feel Birmingham's one of those places where I don't know why, but there's certain cities where, as somebody who kind of grew up in and around Liverpool, there's certain cities where I just feel at home. You know, like obviously Glasgow and whatever, but Birmingham's just one of those places. People are friendly in Birmingham. Like if you don't know where you're going, someone will say to you, "Oh, you know, it's this way." I just feel it's got that friendliness that I really enjoy.
Yeah. Right, we've had a couple of questions that were emailed over to us yesterday, so let's try and get through a few of these. Maggie Alfonsi says, do you think there will be a new norm for sports in terms of audience attendance and participation once the lockdown is over? And therefore, do you think there'll be a greater challenge for sports that involve a lot of contact, such as rugby union?
I do think that's one of the biggest challenges. I think that, you know, being blunt, I think we all understand that we couldn't have crowds, but where you've got contact sports, it's that balance of risks that the health specialists will have to determine. And being honest, you know, we don't want to put any participants at risk, because, you know, we all want sport back. But if in doing so you do it in a way that puts participants at risk, I think that would be a step too far. And anyway, it would be counterproductive, because if you made the situation worse by doing that, I think everybody would feel terrible. So I think it does make the situation worse. I think there are all kinds of ways in which we do want this crisis to kind of lead out into a new normal. I've mentioned women's sport and making sure that the momentum is increased, if anything, and definitely not curtailed. So I think that there's a range of ways in which this should be a moment for reform in sport, and not retrenching.
Okay, thank you. Right, this one's from Clive Briggs from Reward Finance Group. Surely any mainstream sporting event behind closed doors or otherwise will require the attendance of key medical personnel, such as doctors, paramedics, etc. And he's questioning whether this is the most sensible use of their skills at this time. I think that's an obvious point, Ali, isn't it? But
definitely not. Definitely not. I mean, this is exactly the point. Like we we've got to take into account all of these factors before going ahead. And yeah, like it's going to be, it has to be at the moment where we know that we can do it safely. And it's one of the reasons why we mustn't lose sight of grassroots, because actually, you know what, I think we've really learned, as I was saying before, about how much people do value their grassroots physical activity. And if we can do that safely, as and when we can, you know, that will give people a chance to experience sport, you know, but by participating.
And final question from our participants this morning, then I'm going to finish off with getting back into more general politics. Here's a solution to the Premier League football crisis, perhaps, from our very own Jim Hancock, who you, like me, know and love very well.
Hello, Jim.
Jim is saying that a solution perhaps would be to announce that the Premier League would return in March of next year, but to finish the current season, which would then fall quite nicely actually in terms of the timing and logistics, and then obviously the following season could begin again in August. I'm sure there's lots of different scenarios being looked at, but that's one solution that Jim's suggesting.
Yeah, I think what that points to is actually the Gary Neville problem, is that I think there's a lot of chat going around about what the best solutions would be. None of us have oversight over all the contractual and legal complexities about what is in the realm of the possible. But the problem on the football side is that you have a lot of participants and a lot of interests, but nobody who takes an overarching view and looks at it from the point of view of the interests of the public. And that's where the government should be taking a more leading role. Government can't fix it. They haven't got a magic wand, but they could take a role more coordinating all the different participants and look at this with the interests of the public in their mind, rather than any one participant in the conversation where, you know, the Premier League has to look after the Premier League, the EFL has to look after the EFL, the clubs are kind of looking after their own situation. And so I think that's where we do need, as Gary Neville said, can't believe I'm quoting him again, a bit more proactivity from the government on that question.
Okay. Right, Ali, I'm going to sort of start to wind the session up now, but I don't want to let you go without asking you about the Labour Party's new leadership. I think that people are aware of your politics. You were the chair of an organisation called Progress, which, for those who don't know, is not the most pro-Corbynista organisation within the Labour Party. Nonetheless, I always felt that you struck a very solid balance between being constructively critical of some of the things the party did under his leadership and being loyal to that leadership. Listen, we've moved on. We're in a different time. The party's got a new leader. What are your sort of hopes, aspirations for Labour with Keir Starmer at the helm, accepting and acknowledging, as I'm sure you do, that the party has got a huge mountain to climb if it's to get back to being seen as a credible alternative government?
Well, 2 points. Firstly, at this moment in time, our job is to serve the country. And that means doing the thing that I was talking about at the beginning, which is assessing where there is a gap between what needs to be done to respond to this virus outbreak and what we know the government are doing, and mobilising the resources of communities and the government to meet that gap. So I think we're seeing that at the moment on the challenge with testing. There are a bunch of us, myself, Liz Kendall, Jonathan Ashworth and others, who for many, many years have talked about the chronic problems in the fragmented system that we have for social care, for care homes and for domiciliary care. And we are seeing those problems played out right now. So I think the job of the opposition at the moment is to try and describe those problems, to listen to people on the front line, describe them, and to try and encourage and help where necessary the government to attend to those challenges. That is our job at this moment. And you know, I think we've seen some success in getting movement from the government on things that they should be doing. As the opposition, we will always reserve the right to be critical. In the face of this terrible outbreak, it will be constructive criticism so that we can make sure that we do the best job for the country as a whole. It's a very strange situation, therefore, I think, to be taking over for Keir as a new leader of the opposition. It's weird to have him stood on his own doing Prime Minister's questions. It's odd, but on the other hand, it's not the biggest problem we've got as a country right now. So we're just getting on with it. I think in the longer term, I think the Labour Party and the Labour movement and Labour voters have got a view about how they'd like the country to go. I think they've got a view about having a more inclusive country and having a country where there's more opportunities for people and where some of the problems that have been created by the past 10 years are addressed. And we'll get into that. There will be time to get into that view that we have about a different country we'd like to see built. But right now we need to just focus on the crisis and helping the country through that. I think Keir's doing a fantastic job, being honest. I think it's incredibly difficult, but I worked a lot with him over Brexit in his role as Shadow Brexit Secretary, and that was not an easy thing either. And what I learned about Keir during that period was that if there were problems, he was always the first person to pick up the phone and say, how do we fix this? Tell me what the issue is here. Like, how do we move forward? And I see that now. I see that characteristic in him now, that he's a kind of practical politician who's interested in how we can move things forward and how we can get to that vision of a better country that we have. So I think he's an incredible person to have in the job, especially now. And my experience over the past 5 years has been he's a good person to work with, and I have appreciated doing so in the past, and it's good to be working with him now.
Thanks for that analysis. I mean, I think that, wherever your politics, people want genuinely to see a strong government and a strong opposition, an opposition that can genuinely hold the administration to account. And although it's early days, what I've seen from Keir Starmer is that very measured way in which he's identifying some of the issues and putting those points to the government in a constructive way, as you say. Going forward, I think it's going to be interesting to see how he handles what inevitably will become a more combative style of debate in the future. And as a very top barrister, I can't imagine him being fazed by that. So I am looking forward to return to normality, if I can put it that way. Listen, Ali,
I think it's been a weird one, because I do think that virtual parliament's really good. On the other hand, it does feel weird, and I never thought I'd miss Westminster as much as I do. Yeah. Well, I will remind you of a time not that long ago, actually, when you were phoning me up saying that you're in London because I'm fed up in here and it's doing my head in. But things have moved on, and I suppose things change.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for us. Listen, as always, great to speak to you. Some real insight into your new job, which we appreciate. I know you're still getting to grips with some of the issues around that job, and equally, you've got lots of other things to do as a constituency MP as well. So we do value and appreciate your time this morning, Ali. So
no problem.
Hopefully, as I say, we'll see you in Birmingham and other places shortly at a live event.